The Smackdown vs. Raw title series could arguably be claimed as the greatest in all of WWE games. Most, if not all of these games are fondly remembered as engaging snapshots into the Ruthless Aggression era. Today, I am going to be looking back at each of the rosters in these games and determine which game over the years boasts the superior roster. To do this, I'll be using a scoring criteria based off of the roster size, the star power it holds, and the amount of new faces being introduced to the game. These factors will all hold weight when determining which roster is best. Let's get right to it. The OG Smackdown vs. Raw had 50 playable wrestlers plus Paul Heyman as manager, and not counting Legend Undertaker and Masked Kane. Nearly half of this roster had either been a world champion or would become a world champion at some point in their careers. 23 superstars in total, and once again, not counting Legend Taker and Masked Kane. There were 13 new stars brought in from the previous game as well. Smackdown vs. Raw OG was headlined by big names like Eddie Guerrero, Undertaker, Triple H, and Chris Benoit. This game would have the smallest roster in the entire Smackdown vs. Raw title series, but filled with quality stars, stocked with numerous main event names we would see throughout the entire series, and sporting a mid-card featuring a handful of legends in the making. There were quite a few active champions that didn't make it in the game, which is an unfortunate fact when recreating what you watch on television at the time. As far as strengths go, this roster is loaded with star power, capturing just how stacked the WWE main event scene was at this time, making for an incredibly dense list of talent. The worst thing about this roster is definitely the size. It's very top heavy, which serves a purpose for what this game is capable of, though compared to the rest of the games in this series, it doesn't go very far. Final score, 4 out of 10. Smackdown vs. Raw 2006. Smackdown vs. Raw 2006 had 61 playable wrestlers, not counting Hulk Hogan's different personas. It also featured 24 would-be world champions as well. This is definitely one of the greatest rosters of any wrestling games in my opinion. This roster is stacked at every level. The main event is highlighted by Kurt Angle, Triple H, and a budding John Cena. The mid-card is even loaded with star power like Booker T, JBL, Christian, Carlito, and Muhammad Hassan. The women were represented well with Lita, Trish Stratus, and Stacy Keibler, and the lower card was even formidably filled with beloved characters like the Hurricane, Eugene, and Scotty 2 Hotty. Not everyone was a superstar per se, but the large majority of the roster did possess some kind of memorable characteristic or contribution to the industry, which the same cannot be said for lower card acts that would come in during the years that followed. This roster just feels complete. From top to bottom, there are endearing and talented superstars that make for a great time in exhibition, story mode, or most importantly to me, general manager mode. Because of that, the strength of this roster is the overall lack of weaknesses. But if I had to criticize something, I could point my finger at the stars that didn't make it into the game. Matt Hardy, Maven, and at the time of release of the game, the Cruiserweight Champion Juventud Guerrera would have elevated this roster even further had they been included. Final score, 9 out of 10. If you're enjoying the video, please subscribe to the channel for more content. Let me know down below how you feel about these rosters. Smackdown vs. Raw 2007. This iconic game featured 67 playable wrestlers, 25 world champions, and 28 true new superstars. As a new generation of consoles began to land in the homes of gamers, we witnessed the capabilities of these games improve as well, coming in with the largest roster of the title series and upscaled graphics for those with the Xbox 360 would truly give this game a new feel. This may be the most iconic game in the title series, and for good reason. WWE hadn't seen too much turnover on the top end quite yet, despite losing some key upper mid-carders and former world champions. The inclusion of a new wave of memorable characters like Mr. Kennedy, Eminem, Umanga, the Great Khali, and Mark Henry would help alleviate the turnover. A loaded class of legends and a variety of new faces, as well as the true emergence to stardom we witnessed from guys like Batista, John Cena, Randy Orton, and Rey Mysterio that we would see at this time, would certainly help gamers forget about the list of stars that did not return from the year prior like Christian, Chris Jericho, Muhammad Hassan, and many more. However, the overall quality per wrestler in the game I feel isn't quite as high as the year prior. And this is a tough critique, as this is another roster that doesn't possess too many shortcomings. While many of us weren't missing the Bashams, Heidenreich, Steven Richards, or Joy Giovanni, the discrepancy from main event to mid-card is pretty large here in my opinion, with the exception of a few characters like Chris Benoit and Shelton Benjamin. Final score, 8 out of 10. Smackdown vs. Raw 2008. This might be the game that you clicked on this video for. 53 playable wrestlers not counting console exclusives, 20 world champions, and 15 true new superstars would make this roster feel tiny. Whether or not this is the worst roster of all, this is easily the most disappointing roster of any Smackdown vs. Raw game, and I don't think it even comes close. A mix of turnover and tragedy would curse this roster, as well as the addition of an entirely new brand only rolling out 7 wrestlers, one of which can't even be used in GM mode. This game had a lot to live up to as it was following 2 absolute bangers, but the loss of Kurt Angle, Big Show, Rob Van Dam, and Chris Benoit would be felt the most. However, the lack of a true tag team or cruiserweight division would just make this roster feel empty. This game features 3 legitimate tag teams, a laughable fact, and a cruiserweight division that's so bare you need to incorporate light heavyweights. While there was a level of bad luck the WWE was going through with the roster, there are still numerous guys they could have included to add some substance, and those console exclusives, awful choice. Hate it. On the bright side, Jeff Hardy, CM Punk, and MVP made it into the game. Those highly anticipated inclusions would add some excitement, though the overall lackluster roster could not be covered up by 3 big additions. The inclusion of ECW was a flop, and outside the standard big names that would be included in every single Smackdown vs. Raw game, this roster really felt uninspiring and was quite a chore to deal with when playing GM mode featuring 3 brands. Final score, 2 out of 10. Smackdown vs. Raw 2009. 62 playable wrestlers not counting DLC or fictional characters, 20 world champions, all on the active roster that is, and 14 true new superstars. This roster is unique, most notably for the fact there are no legends included, as they were saved for the Legends of WrestleMania cash grab. This would ultimately leave a stain on the reputation of this game, but hear me out, this roster really isn't that bad. Sporting the largest active roster we've seen up to this point, and even adding a few unlockable fictional characters. If you ask me, this is pretty much the roster we should have received the year before. DLC was also rolled out for this game, allowing an additional 9 wrestlers to join the roster as well, for a grand total of a whopping 71 non-fictional playable wrestlers. While many of them had to be unlocked by completing the Road to WrestleMania modes, we as fans were given a roster that could have been exceptional for General Manager mode, but we all know what happened there. This is a large roster exclusively filled with active stars, and there aren't that many that were missed without justification. This was also the first Smackdown vs. Raw game in which all of the active champions at the time of the game's release were included, so bonus points there. Obviously, not including legends is a big deal that cannot be ignored. The game could be discussed as one of the fullest rosters in the series had the legends been included, but instead this game lives in infamy in the minds of many. Final score, 5.5 out of 10. The roster is much better than the game itself. Smackdown vs. Raw 2010. 65 playable superstars not counting DLC. 23 world champions, 15 true new superstars. And what I mean by true new superstars are additions that have not yet been in the game before. For example, Smackdown vs. Raw 2010 featured the return of Christian, however he is not one of the 15 that were counted here. There was a lot of pressure to produce in the next year's iteration of Smackdown vs. Raw, as 2008 was hugely disappointing and 2009 just didn't have a lot to offer beyond an initial playthrough. A new look and feel would accompany Smackdown vs. Raw 2010, and the roster felt fresh and different from what we had gotten used to playing. While there weren't a ton of new names, there was the emergence of new budding stars like Kofi Kingston and Dolph Ziggler, as well as the re-emergence of return stars like Christian and Chris Jericho, while longtime roster members Jeff Hardy, The Miz, and CM Punk had been turning a corner in their careers, carving their own spot in the main event. This would all play a part to give this roster a balanced feel that made for new matches that we hadn't been able to do before. The WWE roster was not at its strongest point during this time period, and the mainstay stars we grew up watching began to age. There was something that definitely felt different about this roster, and depending on who you talk to, could be a good or bad thing. There wasn't anything wrong with the roster as a whole, but in my opinion, each tier of the roster just wasn't as strong as we've grown accustomed to. The largest collection of women wrestlers we've seen up to this point is certainly a strength of this roster, with 13 female competitors available for selection, and once again, all active champions made it into the game. Well done. However, while there were legends available in this game, I'd probably say this was the weakest class we've had available, especially considering Stone Cold Steve Austin was only available through DLC. Final score, 6 out of 10. And finally, Smackdown vs. Raw 2011. 65 playable superstars, not counting DLC or fictional characters. 24 world champions, 13 true new superstars. This is one of the most polarizing and memorable games within the Smackdown vs. Raw title series. Fondly remembered for revolutionary physics, engaging Road to WrestleMania stories, and an improved creative story suite that made for some serious cinema. From the first Smackdown vs. Raw game to now, we are looking at an almost entirely different roster with the exception of a few workhorses that were featured in a game every year and all-time greats that helped define the era. The final rendition of Smackdown vs. Raw gave us fans the final send-off to the Ruthless Aggression era with this roster, as we had The Undertaker, Shawn Michaels, Chris Jericho, Christian, Big Show, Triple H, Rob Van Dam, Matt Hardy, and more, who were all integral to the start of the 21st century for pro wrestling and WWE. These timeless stars were blended perfectly with the now main eventers of today like Drew McIntyre, Sheamus, and Cody Rhodes. It also featured a crop of new stars, some of who would stay with the WWE for years like Wade Barrett and Zack Ryder. This roster, much like the game as a whole, did an excellent job of capturing what had made the Smackdown vs. Raw series such a great title series, and truly delivered a polished product. A formidable main event scene, a mid-card with multiple potential contenders, and plenty of interesting characters for everything in between and below the mid-card. However, as was the case with the WWE at this time, the tag team division was incredibly weak, and this game would suffer with true established tag teams. In addition, gatekeeping Wade Barrett and the nexus behind DLC is not appreciated nowadays, considering the servers have been shut down, meaning if you don't have it now, don't plan on getting it. Overall, I give this roster a 9 out of 10. This will leave us with a draw, Smackdown vs. Raw 2006 and Smackdown vs. Raw 2011. Both sport tremendous rosters, and when deciding a preference, I truly believe that will lie in your age and preference of the generation. I am personally more biased to the early Ruthless Aggression days, and I believe the superstars that didn't make Smackdown vs. Raw 2011 would have been more impactful than the superstars that didn't make the cut for Smackdown vs. Raw 2006. So I give the nod to 2006 with a final score of 9.5, crowning this game as the greatest roster of the entire Smackdown vs. Raw title series. Let me know what you think of these rankings and any changes you would make. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video. Take it easy.